All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Sean Rogers. I am a product manager here at Zycel Communications in Anaheim, California. Just to let you guys know, I am working remotely today from my home. And we have had some power outages over the last 2 weeks. I've had 2 days where power has shut off for 12 hours or more this week and went 3.5 days without power last week. So if the webinar suddenly goes down, it's because they've decided to shut off the power again. Um, due to wildfire prevention. If that does happen and you do get kicked out of the presentation, try to rejoin. I am working off a laptop. I have access to a mobile hotspot, so I will get back online and finish the presentation for you. Um, I don't know how it'll happen though, so it may be one of those things where it kicks everyone off, and then a few minutes later, once I get back online, you'll be able to then rejoin the webinar. So if that happens, do try to rejoin. As we go through today, feel free to send in any questions you have. I prefer you send them in using the question and answer interface in Zoom. Unfortunately, Zoom has recently redesigned their interface, and they seem to have hidden that for most people. So you can also use the webinar chat function to type up any questions you have through the chat. Um, and with that, I'll go ahead and get started. We've got one slide here. We're just talking about, who Zycel is. For those of you that are new Zycel partners who aren't that familiar with us. So basically, we've been making computer networking products for over 30 years. We got started all the way back in 1989. And we have been, our headquarters has been based in the US out of Anaheim and Placentia, California, that entire time. We have switched buildings quite a few times as we've grown. So we've got over 100 million devices that are deployed out in the field. We serve 150 different global markets. Our parent company, our corporate headquarters, is based out of Hsinchu, Taiwan. So officially, we are a Taiwanese company, and then the US offices are out of Anaheim, California. And those Anaheim offices serve not only administrative, that is where our warehouse is at. So that's where all of our products are housed. It is also where our tech support team works. So when you do call in during our business hours, you are talking to Zycel employees at our headquarters there in Anaheim, California. If you call during off hours, you do get rerouted to our German offices and I think sometimes our Taiwan offices. But during regular business hours for us, you're talking to our employees here in Anaheim. So I'm going to go ahead and move on from this and start talking about why you came here, which is Wi-Fi 101. So today's presentation is going to be really light on Zycel product information. This is more of a generic, how Wi-Fi works, what's going on with Wi-Fi, that sort of presentation. There is some maybe Zycel specific stuff towards the end, but for the most part, this is rather generic. So we'll start by talking about the Wi-Fi timeline. So many people don't realize this, but Wi-Fi got started all the way back in 1997. That was when the first 802.11 standard was certified. I joined Zycel all the way back in 2003. And at that point, we were selling, I guess we weren't selling them at that point, but we still had some old inventory around the office and in the warehouse that was 802.11, not 802.11b or A or G, no, just straight 802.11. So we have been doing Wi-Fi basically since the start here in North America. But as you can see over the years, number of different standards have come out. Those of you that are old like me have seen these all come and go. Um, so you will notice there is quite of a big gap between 802.11 AC, aka Wi-Fi 5, and Wi-Fi 6, which didn't get ratified until 2019. And then there was a very short jump to Wi-Fi 6E, and now we've got Wi-Fi 7. So Wi-Fi 7 is only officially ratified in July of this year. In fact, there is still one more step in the certification process that I don't believe has been completed yet. I took a look this morning at the official IEEE timeline, and it is still listed on the in progress section there, although they said it was supposed to be done in September of last year, but nothing's been updated on their website since then, I guess. So you may say, well, wait a minute, Sean, I know there's been Wi-Fi 7 stuff on the market a lot longer than that. So what we are talking about here is the official IEEE standards for Wi-Fi. So the IEEE creates standards for all sorts of networking related stuff, and they're the ones who created Wi-Fi um, and created the standards there. So one of the challenges, though, is chipset vendors don't like to wait, right? Especially consumer product vendors don't like to wait. So what you will often see is you will see vendors first hit the market with products based on the draft certification. So we saw this with 11N. There was pre-N products that were supposed to be upgradable to the full N, which never were. There were 11AC products that were launched in the early days, some of which could be upgraded, most of which could not. And of the 11AC, we had that wave 2, where there was a additional features that weren't supported initially that came out later, although they were always, I think, part of the spec. And we're seeing some of that here with Wi-Fi 7, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So basically, the products hit the market before the standard is actually finalized and ratified. So because of that, there's always sort of this little gap and a sort of a gamble in the early days as to whether the hardware is going to actually be fully compatible or not. And it gets even more confusing these days because there's all sorts of parts of the 802.11 standard that are optional. So even if you do have a product that came out after certification, there is a chance certain features are missing. And in general, product vendors aren't very good at highlighting what is missing. And we will talk a little bit more about that later on. So when it comes to Wi-Fi, there are 3 players in the market that you should be aware of. The first one is IEEE, which I've just been talking about. They're the ones who write the hardware specifications and set out what the products need to do. Now, in the early days of Wi-Fi, there was a problem with that. First one is people are writing these standards, and there's always things that are open to interpretation. One person may interpret certain parts of the standard differently than others, and in some cases, some people may just choose to skip parts of the standard for whatever reason. So that's where the Wi-Fi Alliance came in. So a number of both chipset manufacturers and hardware manufacturers like Zycel got together and said, hey, this doesn't work. Some people's hardware isn't compatible with other people's hardware. We can't have that. It's going to scare people off from using Wi-Fi. So they formed this Wi-Fi Alliance. So it's an industry group. And at least initially, their main thing there was basically enforcing interoperability. So the Wi-Fi Alliance creates a number of tests. And in order to use the Wi-Fi logo, you have to have your products go through those tests and prove that your product meets certain minimum standards as far as aspects of the Wi-Fi standard and as far as interoperability with other vendors' products. They are also behind just in general marketing Wi-Fi. They're the ones who created the term Wi-Fi, I believe, or at least registered it as a trademark. And so you had to be certified by them to use that logo. And in theory, you were supposed to, at least in the early days, not call it Wi-Fi unless you had been certified or your products had been certified. They are also the ones who changed the naming. So for many years here, you would call a product 802.11n, or you would shorten it to just 11n, 11ac, etc. So Wi-Fi a few years ago came around and decided to rebrand Wi-Fi as Wi-Fi 11n became Wi-Fi 4, 11ac became Wi-Fi 5, then we had Wi-Fi 6, which is your 11ax, and then 11be is now Wi-Fi 7. And they did that because they felt that using those abbreviations 11N, 11AC, etc., was too confusing for consumers, especially trying to keep track of which ones were newer than others. So by giving them simple numbers, it was easier for people to understand what generation of Wi-Fi they were using. And then there is the FCC. So the FCC's job is basically to monitor our radio waves and set rules for being able to use radio waves. So they'll tell you how much power you can use. They'll set standards like how much bleed over you can have, etc. So it's a combination of those 3 that create what is basically the Wi-Fi environment here in the US today. So moving on from these guys, Wi-Fi works using radio waves. So really, Wi-Fi products are no different from walkie-talkies in the days of old. And so when we're going through and talking about Wi-Fi, it really helps to try to keep that in mind. If you're like me and you played with a little cheap walkie-talkies as a kid, and you remember some of the issues and problems you had, you will see those same issues and problems with Wi-Fi simply because they're using the same RF spectrum and it's an unlicensed space, and just the behavior of radio waves is the same. So just a couple things to keep in mind. In general, as frequency goes up, it's easier to encode more data onto it. That was why back in the days of 11B and 11A, A was faster because it was using 5 gigahertz instead of 2.4. Now, modern standards like Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 7 um, get kind of away from this and just have a unified experience, a unified standard, regardless of which channel you are currently using, in part because encoding technologies have gotten so advanced that it sort of solves some of those issues, but in general, that's the way it goes. You may remember if you've been using cordless phones, like not mobile phones, but those of us that are old that had house phones, we went from 900 megahertz cordless phones to 2.4 gigahertz cordless phones and up to 5 gigahertz cordless phones. And the primary difference on a regular end-to-end user experience was just that the sound quality got better. Why? Because the frequency went up and they were able to cram some more data onto it. Another challenge, though, as frequency goes up, the range goes down. So the same thing, using that cordless phone analogy. If you started off using cordless phones when they were using 900 megahertz, you could walk down the block talking to your friends, and it was amazing how far that connection could go. Whereas a 5 gigahertz cordless phone, you're lucky if it covers all the rooms in your house if you have a larger house. And that's because as the frequency went up, the range went down. Now, another benefit over this time is as these frequencies got higher, the FCC has opened up more spectrum for everyone to share. So that was another reason why you wanted to upgrade your 900 megahertz phone to a 2.45, especially if you lived in an apartment or a condo, was because there just wasn't that much bandwidth available that everyone had to share. So the FCC has opened up these very small sections of frequency that you can use without a license. Otherwise, to use other parts of the RF spectrum, you do have to have a license and follow all sorts of rules. So that's why Wi-Fi products don't use the same channels as your TV set or as your AM or FM radio does. So we started with 900. They opened up 2.4. 5 was opened up, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s. And then just recently, they opened up about 2 years ago the 6 gigahertz chunk of spectrum. And we will break that down and talk more in detail about that. But just be aware, if you are using a wireless device, it is using one of these 4 chunks of spectrum, regardless of whether it's Wi-Fi or not. Everyone has to share. This is unlicensed spectrum, and you, by rule, are not supposed to cause interference with other users sharing that spectrum with you. So you have to play nicely with them. So when talking about radio waves and the strength of your Wi-Fi signal, officially the way it is measured is by using dBm, decibel milliwatts. It's also the same as if you do speakers. Some other audio stuff tends to use dBm as well for measuring sound. So dBm is a logarithmic way of using or measuring energy. And they use this on radio waves because it's easier to use. It's very easy to denote small or both big and small changes in power output. But more importantly for Wi-Fi users, is you're able to add and subtract dBm from each other very easily. And more importantly, you're able to use dBi, which is the measurement for how much amplification you're getting out of like an antenna. And you're able to add and subtract those together and very easily calculate your total radiated output power. So from an engineering perspective, it's a lot easier to use than just using standard milliwatts. And in the old days of Wi-Fi, you were probably doing a lot of that. It used to be standard that basically any Wi-Fi device, especially an access point or router, had external antennas, and it was very common for people to jerry-rig all sorts of weird types of antennas and placements of antennas to create coverage back in the day. Although these days it's very rare to find an indoor access point with external antennas that you can modify or change. But if you grew up in the consumer side of things, you would see power advertised as milliwatts. So I guess the question would be, why is that? And the answer for that is because milliwatts are more impressive sounding than dBm, right? So a 100 milliwatt product, if you double your output power, you have a 200 milliwatt product. So it sounds like a huge increase, right? You've doubled the output power of your device. So for marketing, it was really a big way to market your products and show just how much more powerful you were. And most home users didn't have to worry about dBm and dBi because they weren't calculating any differences. They were just using the antennas that came bundled with the product. So that same 100 milliwatt to 200 milliwatt, when expressed in dBm, is just a 3-point jump. So from 20 dBm to 23 dBm doesn't sound nearly as impressive when you're advertising it. So when we're dealing with dBm, every 3 dBm increase is a doubling of your milliwatt power. And neither of these are a perfect way of determining your range or coverage of your products. Doubling power from 100 milliwatt to 200 milliwatt does not double the coverage area, does not double how far the signal goes. We will talk a little bit here in a future slide. I do have the formula there for calculating how far a signal will go. But I would say, as a general rule of thumb, the differences on dBm more closely match real world differences in range than using milliwatts. You know, it's much closer to the small difference between 20 and 23 than it is to the huge difference you see using milliwatts. So there's a couple things that people, or some terms that you will hear when talking about Wi-Fi and radio in general. I'll start with the bottom one there, attenuation. Attenuation is just a fancy way of saying how much the signal lessens as it travels from where it was broadcast from. So basically, as you broadcast your Wi-Fi signal, as it travels through the atmosphere, some of that energy gets absorbed by the water molecules and dust and whatnot, the air itself. And so your signal slowly gets weaker and weaker as it travels through space. And as a general rule, the denser the medium, the more attenuation you will have. So a signal will travel much further through open air than it will if you're trying to broadcast it through cement. So that is something to keep in mind, how it drops off and how it behaves when passing through different substances. The big one here I want to talk about, though, is signal to noise ratio. This is probably the most ignored yet most important when it comes to Wi-Fi behavior and how good your Wi-Fi connection is. So signal to noise ratio is basically a measurement of your signal, the RF that you want to hear and understand, or the data you want to capture, versus the amount of noise that's around you, also in that RF space. So an analogy to this would be you and your friend go and have a conversation at the bar. It's early in the day. There's no music playing. There's few other patrons there. So you're able to hold a conversation with each other very simply at normal volume, because the signal, the conversation that you were having, is very strong compared to the background noise around you. But as the day goes on, more patrons come in, music gets turned on, or the game gets put on the TV, the noise level goes up, and you'll now have difficulties hearing your partner across the table. You may need to increase your signal by raising your voice for them to be able to hear you. You may have to get closer together to continue to have that conversation. So that's what signal to noise ratio is. And it's very, very important when it comes to the quality of your Wi-Fi connection and the speeds you can achieve. So now we're talking about path loss. So we're going back to attenuation. So when it comes to open air, this is the formula that you would use to calculate how far the Wi-Fi signal would go. So for most of you, not that important, but I just want to show you it is a logarithmic function here, which is why using the logarithmic dBm is a little bit closer to approximating the differences in coverage as you increase the signal. For those of you doing outdoor point-to-point, this is probably really handy for you, although these days there are a number of tools, both paid and free, that you can use to calculate your link budget when doing those outdoor point-to-point links. And this is just showing you here, you know, what sort of dB loss you could expect and how it would affect the range here. So you'll see a standard glass window would give you approximately a 3 dB loss. So it would have the output power, but it would actually only reduce range by about 30%. Tinted windows, because it's metal tinting on there, will have a much more significant effect on the dB loss of the signal itself. And then just in general, as things go up in density, the harder it is for the signal to go through. The one exception to that is wireless mesh. Wireless mesh, depending on the size of the holes and how it matches up with the RF signal, can absolutely block an RF signal from getting through, especially if that Wi-Fi wireless mesh is grounded in some way. It will absorb the signal, the Wi-Fi signal, and significantly go to block it. So that is something to keep in mind, especially for those of you that live in the Southwest where stucco is very common. Stucco is just wood wrapped in chicken wire and then a thin layer of concrete put on it. It's not the concrete that's usually causing you issues. It is that chicken wire interfering with the signal leaking out. And then when it comes to Wi-Fi range, so this is of course one of the most common questions we get. It's why I've been talking at least a little bit here about, you know, measuring your radio strength and attenuation and things like that is because people are always trying to figure out what their Wi-Fi range is going to be. So Wi-Fi range is a combination of signal strength, so the strength of that signal that you're trying to pick up, the signal to noise ratio, how much other noise is operating on that same RF channel that you're trying to listen to, attenuation, how much is that signal dropped, what is it going through, and the frequency being used. But one thing that tends to get overlooked a lot is that Wi-Fi is two-way communication. The access point is sending data to the client. The client is then sending data back to the access point. Even if you are doing something that at least initially seems to be unidirectional, like you are streaming a Netflix video, so most of the data is coming from the access point and being broadcast to your client. However, the client still has to be able to talk back to the access point and let it know, hey, I received those packets. It's clear to send the next packets, or to say, those packets were corrupt. Please rebroadcast those packets to me. So what that means is it's very possible and very common for your client device, in this case, an iPhone, an old iPhone, is able to hear the signal just fine, but the access point isn't able to hear the signal coming back from your handheld device or your mobile device. And a big part of the reason for that is access points and routers tend to have a lot of output power. They are hooked up to AC voltage. So we crank the power up and they can send that signal really far. 500 milliwatt is not that uncommon to find in access points. It's not that uncommon to find more powerful access points or routers than, half a watt here. Whereas your phone or your tablet or your other mobile device, those are usually designed to operate off of batteries. So because of that, they have less powerful broadcast capability. They also have less room inside for antennas, and those antennas are pressed right onto the main PCBA where they may be subject to EMI issues. Your hand may be covering up the antenna, etc. So because of that, your client device is not able to send the signal as far back to the access point. And so you can run into those situations, particularly on Apple products, where your phone says you've got a pretty decent Wi-Fi connection, but the Wi-Fi doesn't work. And oftentimes this is the cause, because your phone is telling you how strong the signal is that it sees from the access point. It has no idea whether the access point is receiving the signal back from it very well or at all. So that's why you run into those issues where you go, say, I've got 2.5 bars of Wi-Fi signal, yet my Wi-Fi is not working. Why is that? Very common issue. So just keep that in mind. It's a two-way conversation, and both sides need to be able to hear each other, but both are not able to send out or shout as loud as each other. One is much, much louder than the other. So the one that has a lower volume has to get closer to the access point. So this is why when you are using an access point and talking to a client device, your range maybe will say 150, 200 feet. But if you're doing an access point to another access point in a bridge scenario, you can get 100 yards instead of the 150 feet because the output power is so much more between the two. So another thing to talk about is how radio waves behave out in the environment. They've got a lot of different behaviors that you can see. So when you transmit your signal, as a general rule, most products are using what they call an omnidirectional antenna, and it will broadcast the signal outwards in 360 degrees, radiating out. So no matter which direction you go, you're getting the same signal being broadcast at roughly the same power output. As it travels through the environment, you will see different things happening. So a radio wave can hit something and bounce off of it. When it hits something that's really dense, it can travel through it, although the signal itself is going to be attenuated or lessened. It can also reflect, or not reflect, sort of like wrap around a physical object. Now, if you've ever played in a pond and thrown rocks out in the pond, you've seen this exact same behavior. You can go out to your local park's duck pond and throw some rocks in there, and you will see the waves radiate out in roughly a 360-degree pattern from where the rock hit the water. And if you watch those waves and how they interact with other objects in the pond, you will see the same behavior. You can see those waves reflecting off of, say, a brick shoreline. You can also see if you've got something like a dock in that water where it's got poles going into the water, you can watch the waves hit that physical object and wrap around it. So they can actually hit it from this side, wrap all the way around, and then continue out from the other. It's really interesting. It's the same thing that Wi-Fi does. And the reason I am bringing this up is we will come back to it, but this causes problems, or at least it used to. This used to be the bane back in the 11BGA days, and in the early N days, this was a nightmare because what happens is the signal goes out. So you've got one signal that penetrates through this object here and then hits your client device over here, or anyway. So the sender sending it over here to your receiver, so it's able to hear the signal here, but the signal also has gone up here, hit this object, and then reflected down. It may have bounced off of something over here and reflected a different direction. So what you end up with is the RF equivalent of an echo. You hear this quiet signal first because it's the most direct path. It's quiet because it's had to pass through an object, but then you'll hear that exact same signal reflected off of this wall here slightly later because it's taken slightly longer to get there because it's taken a longer path. But the signal is stronger, then you've got another reflection over here with a slightly different length. So now you've got the same signal being heard 3 times, basically 3 echoes. And it used to cause all sorts of issues. And as we get further on, I'll talk about how it's no longer an issue, it's now a benefit, but that has been a common problem. And it's something you've probably witnessed yourself if you ever listened to AM radio on a long road drive. You drive in a valley between 2 hills and you'll get almost a strobe-like effect where the signal is going in and out. And that's because you're picking up those reflections as the signal hits the different sides of the valley and bounces into you. So up until Wi-Fi 6, and still to this point for legacy clients, this is how you determine who gets to broadcast. So when we're dealing with Wi-Fi, and I think I skipped it on the earlier slide, basically, only one person gets to broadcast at a time. So everyone has to take turns broadcasting. Your access point broadcast, then your client broadcast. If you've got multiple clients, they have to take turns broadcasting. If you get 2 or more devices broadcasting at the same time, you get interference and basically the packet gets dropped and has to be rebroadcast. Going back to my walkie-talkie analogy, it was the same thing that would happen with your friends. If 2 of you tried to talk on your walkie-talkies, the third person listening would just get a bunch of garbled noise that couldn't be made out because the radio waves are operating on the same channel and they interfere with each other. Same thing with Wi-Fi. So back in 1997, when they were figuring out how to handle that, they determined that there wasn't enough bandwidth there to do coordination, right? The original 802.11 was really slow. And they didn't want to slow it down further by having, a centralized device coordinating who gets to broadcast. So instead, what they did is they created this very simple little flow chart for determining if you get to send your signal or not. So if you've got something you want to send, you first sense the media. And all that means is you listen. Is somebody else broadcasting? No, no one else is broadcasting. Excuse me, so it's idle, so no one else is broadcasting, then you get to send your packet. If somebody else is broadcasting, it uses a random number generator to determine how long you wait, and then you start the process over again. And eventually you'll find a time when no one else is broadcasting and you'll get to broadcast. So it worked okay back in the days, but these days, you've got a lot more wireless clients than you had back then, and you've got people sending a lot more data, especially if you're doing streaming. You're sending constant data. So this now causes issues where it's very common for two or more people to sense the medium, determine no one else is broadcasting, and then both broadcast at the same time. Packets get dropped because they interfere with each other, and both have to then resend those packets. So it's often caused just by, too many people trying to broadcast at the same time. There's also this thing called the hidden node problem, which contributes to this as well. So here's a situation. Your access point here is here in the center of the room. You've got a client on this side of the room. You've got another client on this side of the room. Both want to be able to broadcast and talk to the access point. The problem is the access point can see or hear both of these clients, but the clients are too far from each other to hear. So when they do that sense thing where they're sensing the medium to see if anyone else is broadcasting, this one can't hear this one broadcasting. This one can't hear this one broadcasting. So they'll both think that, hey, it's a-okay to send my signal. They'll both broadcast at the same time. The access point is picking up both of those signals. They interfere with each other. Packets get dropped. This is also, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but this is also one of the limiting factors when it comes to how many users you can get on an access point, right? People will ask all the time, well, how many clients does your access point support? And it's probably a big number depending on which access point you're looking at. It could be 512 or more client devices, but that's essentially assuming that those client devices aren't doing anything. If you have 512 client devices in range of an access point, all trying to talk to it at the same time, thanks to this problem with the hidden node issue, and thanks to just the problem here with the fact they all have to take turns broadcasting, is you end up in a situation where you max out not how many clients the access point can support, you max out how many clients the RF environment can support. So if you've got a bunch of clients that aren't really broadcasting anything, like a smart plug that just periodically checks to see whether or not it should turn itself on or off, you can fit a lot of them on an access point. If you have users wanting to stream a live football game, you're going to be able to get considerably less clients using that access point before you start running into issues, because there just isn't enough available airtime for all of those users to send traffic or to have traffic broadcast to them. And we'll talk more about it later, but since it ties into this, I did want to bring that up now. Another very common problem we run into in this industry when it comes to wireless is the differences between what I am calling data rate versus throughput. So when you look at data sheets and manufacturers advertising, what you will see advertised is what I am calling the data rate. Now I'm saying I'm calling them these because these terms have multiple definitions, and some people may use them differently than I'm using them. But it is important to know that there are two different ways basically of measuring how much data you can send, and one gets used a lot by advertising and one gets used by people trying to measure how fast their internet connection is. So based on IEEE standards, the amount of data being broadcast or transmitted between two devices is all of the data being broadcast or transmitted between those two devices. So that's what we call the data rate. That's what you will see on the data sheet. So you will see like our NWA 130BE is a BE 11,000 product. It is able to send, in ideal situations, right, basically 11 gigs of data, 11 gigabits per second of data on the wireless network. But what happens is when people do their speed tests, they're not measuring the data rate, they are measuring the throughput. So the data rate is everything that's being sent. The throughput is just what you want to send. So for instance, the way most speed tests work is you download a file off of a central server somewhere, and it measures how long it takes to send that data and converts it into a data speed. Which is great. It works well. But the challenge of that is it doesn't measure the protocol overhead and other overhead that's in there. So in the old days of Ethernet and wired connections, there wasn't much difference between the data rate and the throughput, because with Ethernet, there is very little overhead. There's some TCP overhead, but there's very little handshaking stuff. So Wi-Fi, remember, is using radio waves in an unlicensed environment where there's all sorts of things that are going to be causing interference and problems, right? You have to share it with your neighbor's Wi-Fi, you have to share it with your Bluetooth devices, you have to share it with your microwave, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's just a lot of industrial equipment and stuff out there which produces interference. There's all those reflective issues I was talking about and echo issues with the Wi-Fi signal. So because of that, there is a tremendous amount of overhead when using Wi-Fi versus when using Ethernet. So because of that, there is a big difference between the data rate, how much data is sent from one wireless device to another, versus the throughput, which is how fast it takes you to send your file, because your file is maybe only 40 to 60% of the data that's actually being transmitted. So that's why, you can pull up Amazon, pull up any wireless product, start reading reviews. It won't be long before you find someone saying, hey, this product says it's 5 gigs, but I measured it and I'm only getting 2. So one of the many reasons why that happens is because of this. There are also issues just with, okay, great, your access point can support a certain speed, but your client devices can't. So there's a lot of other things which may contribute to that, but this is a big one here. This is one that's always going to be there. So just as a general rule, your data rate is going to be about twice what your actual measured throughput in an ideal situations is going to be. It varies a little bit based on the protocol and some other stuff like that. But as a general rule, you know, roughly 50% of your data rate is what you can expect to see. It's also just to talk about this as well. The data rate is measuring from one wireless device to another wireless device, talking directly to each other. Um, so a lot of you, though, are measuring, when measuring throughput, or measuring from your wireless device, your laptop, will say, to the access point, to the wired network, out onto the internet or to a server that you're running locally. So it's actually going through a lot more steps than just the access point. And oftentimes the wired connection, especially with today's faster products, the wired connection is your bottleneck. And oftentimes on the access point is able to handle more data on the wireless side than it's able to funnel through to the wired side. For instance, it's very common on some of your cheaper Wi-Fi 7 access points that they will have a 1 gig connection, even though the wireless side of things can handle 5 or more. So that your link to your wired network is actually your bottleneck. So one more thing to take into account when you're testing stuff. So how do I increase speed? I am coming at this not from you out in the field, but how, as an industry, how has Wi-Fi increased speeds over time? There's 3 main ways that it has been done. We've been able to increase the encoding, how much data we can cram onto those radio waves. So we went from 64-bit QAM to 256-bit QAM to 1024 QAM, and now with Wi-Fi 7, 4096 QAM. We've increased spatial streams. So we will talk about what spatial streams are coming up here. It's very important, and it's been a game changer when it comes to, Wi-Fi speeds. It's also why some of your wireless clients can never get more than a third of the max speed that you would expect to see. And then the other way is increasing bandwidth. How much of the available shared spectrum are you using at a time? So with 11BGA, we were using 20 megahertz channels. 11N increased that to 40 megahertz channels. 11AC bumped that up to 80. 11AC Wave 2 bumped that up to 160. And now with Wi-Fi 7, we're up to 320 megahertz channels. So we'll break it down a little bit here for you. So to begin with, we're talking about, so basically we're taking that last slide and we're going to go through it in reverse order. So we'll start here with bandwidth. So when it comes to 2.4 gigahertz in the US, there are only 11 channels to choose from. So everyone has to share those channels, which sounds great, except you might remember our channels that we're using for Wi-Fi are approximately 20 megahertz in size, whereas these standard 2.4 channels are only around 5 megahertz in size. So you don't really have 11. In actuality, here in North America, you've essentially got three non-overlapping 20 megahertz channels you can use. So you can have three different devices, three different access points, three different routers in the area, broadcasting on 2.4 before they start overlapping with each other and causing interference. Now with 11N, we doubled bandwidth from 20 to 40 megahertz. So again, here in the US, we don't have 13 like Europe, we have 11. And the way this works basically is there's one 20 megahertz channel that everyone has to share. So if you set your access point or router to 40 megahertz on 2.4, and your neighbor does as well, you will be causing interference with each other because there will be some overlap between those two 40 megahertz channels, right? There's only 60 megahertz available. You need 80 to support two devices using this, so there will be interference issues. So the solution to this with 11N was 5 gigahertz. So with 11N, you started to see dual band routers and access points come out, and with 11AC, this became standard to support 2.4 and 5 gigahertz out of the box. So why is that? Because 5 gigahertz is a lot bigger. You can see here, these are 20 megahertz channels. You've got, I think it's 26, something like that, non-overlapping 20 megahertz channels, right? So you can have a lot of access point or routers in a small area and not have to worry about interference. So it's great for condos and apartment buildings and things like that. It's also beneficial, right? Because the signal goes up, the range goes down. So you've also got less interference if you do have overlapping channels because the signal isn't going to go as far. But you will notice that I have some different colors on here, right? Most of these channels are highlighted in orange or yellow. So why is that? These are called DFS channels. So before 5 gigahertz was made unlicensed, this used to be licensed spectrum. So in order to use 5 gigahertz, you had to have a license. And so when the FCC opened this up for unlicensed users, they put in place this rule called DFS, which basically takes most of those channels and basically says, before you can broadcast anything on these channels, you have to listen and see if anybody else nearby who has a license, or in the case that or is using weather radar, if one of those two things exist, you must immediately stop broadcasting that channel and you can't use it again. You have to switch to another one. And you have to keep, testing it. As soon as you detect those issues, you have to disconnect it. So the challenge you run in there is it can be a bad user experience. If you live somewhere or your office is somewhere where there is some form of 5 gigahertz, whether it's an existing user, whether it's radar, or whether it's just RF noise being produced by industrial equipment that tricks the access point into thinking it's a licensed user, because it's a very dumb system. So basically, if it sees 5 gigahertz and doesn't recognize it as an unlicensed user, it turns it off. So users get disconnected a lot, and it can take a few seconds for users to get back on because the access point has to change channels, wait and listen to make sure no one else is using that channel, and then start broadcasting it. So if you're in an area where it has something like this, your users may be getting kicked off pretty frequently throughout the day, which can be really annoying, especially on, today's telemeetings and stuff. The other challenge you run into is a lot of consumer equipment doesn't even support these DFS channels. So it costs more to get DFS certified. And I don't know how it is today, but a few years ago, it added 6 months to your certification time. So it was very common for especially consumer products to say, you know what? I don't want to give my competitors 6 months head start selling this type of product. So I'm just going to sell the product today and just not support DFS. Now, it is possible to add DFS support through a firmware update, but again, most consumers are not updating the firmware on their devices after they've installed it. So for those reasons, a lot of the consumer grade equipment doesn't support it. We ran into this just recently with an MDU deployment. The MDU was using Roku sticks with a custom app to provide IPTV for residents in a condo building. None of those Roku sticks supported DFS. And even if you do have a product that does support DFS, I've got a Amazon Fire product that in theory supports DFS, but I find that it tends to overheat and crash when using DFS channels. Um, so even if your product says it supports DFS, it may not work just because I think a lot of consumer companies, even if they're going to support it, aren't really testing it and verifying their engineering on the amplifier and chip and things like that. So for those reasons, a lot of you out there are going to decide not to use DFS channels, right? You've deployed a network at your customer's office. You don't want to have to explain to them that the reason Bob can't get on the Wi-Fi is because Bob has a cheap Lenovo laptop and the chip they used in there doesn't support the DFS channels that you're using. So because of that, with your 20 megahertz channels, you go from 20 some channels that are non-overlapping down to nine non-overlapping channels. So you've dramatically reduced the number of devices you can have before you start having interference. But then, we want to increase speed, and we do that by increasing bandwidth. So if we go up from 20 megahertz channels to 40 megahertz channels, now we've only got 4 non-overlapping 5 gigahertz channels, right? So we've gone from 23 or 26 or whatever this is down to 4. But we want faster speeds, so we bump it up to 80 megahertz channels. Now you've only got 2 non-overlapping, non-DFS channels that you can use and your users can connect to. So as soon as you have a third access point or a third neighbor, you will have interference issues. And then we jumped it up to 160 megahertz channels. Well, to use 160 megahertz channels, you must use DFS channels. You must be using some of that DFS spectrum. So you now run into that problem where, your Wi-Fi may periodically shut itself off for a few seconds. Or, some of your users are unable to connect to the network because you're using this solid DFS only, 160 megahertz channel. And as a general rule, most products, especially consumer products, have things set to the fastest speed possible by default. So they will use as much bandwidth as that device supports. Although I have seen recently a lot of newer products will default to 80 instead of defaulting to 160. But for a while there, it was really common for everything to default to 160 and cause calls like, hey, I've set up this new router and the Wi-Fi doesn't work. I can't see it. It's not broadcasting. And the answer was, well, it's because your client device doesn't support the DFS channel or the 160 megahertz channel that it is broadcasting on because it's DFS and your client isn't. So for a while there was a lot of calls about stuff like this. All right, moving on from bandwidth and available channels to spatial streams. So as we talked about before, your wireless signal can bounce off of stuff. And because of that, you get an echo effect where the data takes different routes, straight route and different bounces of different lengths. Because they're different lengths, takes slightly longer, right, for a signal to travel a longer distance and a shorter distance. You get this echo effect called multipath. So this was a common problem in the early days of Wi-Fi. And then some smart people turned this into a benefit. Some of those smart people worked for one of our subsidiaries. So for a while at Zycel in Taiwan, on our bottom floor, we had a partner or a subsidy called, I don't remember the name now. It was Zy something. Anyway, they had some of the only patents. They had found ways to turn multipath from a problem to a benefit. We ended up selling them to Atheros, who ended up getting bought out by Qualcomm. So some of Qualcomm's patents on multipath and MIMO today comes from Zycel back in the day. But anyway, the idea here is some smart people, way smarter than I obviously am, figured out how to take this echo effect and transmit different data on each echo. Basically, some data comes out of one antenna and some data comes out of a different antenna. And because those antennas are slightly spaced apart from each other, the signal will take slightly different paths as it bounces off of things in the environment. And you can then have your client device be able to, instead of those things merging together, treat them as separate signals. So if you had one antenna, you could send it, for instance, this is an 11N scenario because the numbers are easier to use, 150 megabits. If you add a second antenna, you can send a separate 150 megabit stream. So these are what we call spatial streams, taking advantage of the different paths an RF signal will travel and sending different data on those paths, even though you're still using the same RF channel. Because there's taking these different paths and creating these echoes, with this special smart technology, it doesn't interfere with each other anymore. It now becomes a net benefit. So in this situation, if you had a third antenna, it would send a different 150. So with two different antennas sending two different spatial streams, your client device can pick up a total signal of 300 megabits per second. If it had a third radio, it'd be 450 megabits per second. So that is called MIMO, multiple in, multiple out. And historically, this has worked only from the access point back to the client device. Now we added something with 11AC Wave 2 called multi-user MIMO, MU MIMO. And this uses that same technique, but now each of these data streams is going to a different client. So the aggregated throughput is still 300 megabits per second, but you can send one stream of 150 megabits per second to one client and one stream of 150 megabits per second to another client at the same time. So it frees up additional airtime so you can fit more users on there, assuming most of the transmission and most of the data is traveling from the access point to the client device. And the reason I say that is up until Wi-Fi 6, all MU-MIMO was from AP or router to client device. The client devices still have to wait till no one else is broadcasting to send their acknowledgement signal back to the access point. So when you look on data sheets for business class products, you normally don't find this on consumer products. What you will see is on the data sheet, oftentimes it won't even tell you the speed of the connection. It will simply tell you the number of spatial streams supported, and just assume you know that 11N is 150 megabits per spatial stream, or that Wi-Fi 5 is, what is it, 433? Oh, my mind's gone blank here. Anyway, so that you would know what the speeds are off of each spatial stream. So you will see like 3x3, 2x2, etc. So what that's telling you is the first number is how many spatial streams your device can transmit, and the other number is how many spatial streams your device can receive. In general, on access points and routers, these numbers will be the same. On client devices, however, most client devices will have a small number and then a bigger number. So most client devices will be able to pick up 2, 3, or more spatial streams when listening to your access point. But when they transmit back to the access point, they'll only be able to support, say, one spatial stream. Very common. And they're doing this to save energy, right? It takes a lot of energy to transmit these radio signals. So if you're sending 2 data streams, you're using roughly twice the power. It's not quite as simple as that, but we'll just call it that, right? So for a lot of those reasons, your client devices can transmit at a much lower rate than they can receive data at. You will also see on some data sheets something like this, 4x4:3. Cisco is the main one who uses this or does this, although we also do it on our NWA 50AX Pro and NWA 90AX Pro products. So these numbers here are how many antennas you have that can broadcast and how many antennas that can receive, just like before. But the colon, the number after the colon here, is how many can actually be used at once. So for instance, our NWA 50AX Pro, it is a 3x3:2. So it's got 3 transmit radios, or 3 transmit antennas, 3 receive antennas, but it can only use 2 of those at any one time. So why do people do this? In theory, it gives you a little bit more flexibility on which antennas you were using. So if you've got 3, you can choose the 2 with the best signal. I don't know how much of a difference it makes. It's certainly not as good as using something like Smart Antenna. So anyway, here's just sort of a combination. So how do I know how fast my maximum connection is? So with 11AC, your maximum speed is, per spatial stream, 866 megabits per second. But that's assuming you're using 160 megahertz channels. If you don't want to use DFS channels, you're limited to 80 megahertz. So now your maximum speed per spatial stream is 433 megabits per second. So that's what you'll drop down to. Now, maybe you've got some poor signal to noise ratio, and because of that, 256 QAM can't be used, so it will drop down to 64 QAM. So now it'll drop your speed from 433 down to 325. So just showing you here how variable it can be and how these three things interact with each other to determine your maximum speed. So again, if you're doing a speed test on speedtest.net to test out your access point, if your access point supports 3 channels, but your client device can only transmit or can only receive 2, you're not going to get the full max speed. You're going to drop down to 2 spatial streams here and get basically 1/3 less overall throughput. If your client device doesn't support DFS, then you're going to drop down to 80, etc. Okay, so now we're going to revisit this. How many devices can I get on one AP? And the answer is, I don't know. And anyone who tells you they know is lying, unless they've actually deployed this exact same set of hardware before in the field and pushed it to its limits. Do not believe what is on the data sheets. The data sheet is telling you essentially how much memory is allocated to the association table in the access point. So it'll be 256, it'll be 512, it'll be 1024. But that doesn't actually tell you how many you're going to get on there, because it's not going to be your access point which limits how many clients you have. It's the available airtime for that channel and channel bandwidth that you were using that's going to determine how many client devices you can get on that network. So here is a theoretical example to explain how just by changing one aspect, right? We were talking about bandwidth, we were talking about QAM, the encoding, and we were talking about spatial streams. So in this scenario, the only thing we are changing is spatial streams. So we have a bunch of wireless users connecting to a 5 gigahertz access point. They are using the smallest 20 megahertz channels. Again, this is just for this theoretical example here. And each of them is streaming a YouTube video that requires 3 megabits per second download. So you will be able to fit 34 laptops onto that access point, and all 34 users will be able to stream without issue. You add any additional users, you will start running into issues with the stream because all users won't be able to get 3 megabits per second. So if we change the spatial streams on the client device, so the client device can only use 2 instead of 3, now you can only fit 21 users on that same access point watching that same video. Right? So that's a pretty significant difference. And then if we use client devices that only support one spatial stream, like cheap tablets or cheap cell phones, now you're only going to be able to fit 10 of them onto that same access point before you start running into issues. So this is why I'm saying, that number on the data sheet, it doesn't matter if this access point can support 512 or 1024 or 4096 clients on the data sheet. The clients themselves are going to eat up all of the airtime long before you get to whatever that hard limit is on the hardware itself. And this is true for any vendor. This is true for any brand of access point or router. It's very, very rare for the access point or router to be the limiting factor. Maybe on some super ultra cheap stuff you buy from a no-name vendor on Amazon, but anything from a named vendor, your issue is going to be the available airtime that's available for clients and how they are sharing it. And you're going to max out that airtime long before you get to whatever's on that data sheet. So I'm going to talk now, we'll move over and start talking about antennas now and antenna technology. And we're going to start by talking about smart antenna. So we're going to use the term here called co-channel interference. And that's basically when 2 or more devices are sharing the same channel and they interfere with each other. So you've got one access point operating on channel 36. You've got another access point on the other side of the building operating on channel 36. If they're close enough together, you will have interference issues. So the traditional way you deal with co-channel interference First off, you spend a lot of time planning where you put your APs and which channel each AP is using. Although these days, most of you just turn on auto channel selection and leave it at that. Part of the problems when it comes to, planning out your channels is it only works if you don't have any neighbors. If you're in an office building with multiple tenants, you have no control over what those guys' networks are doing in the RF environment, and you're still having to share, Wi-Fi and the airtime with them. So anyway, you would turn down the power so they don't overlap with each other as much. Now, the downside with this is the overall signal strength is lower, so it may cause other issues with signal to noise ratio or just with overall signal strength in general. So you may be, trading off, unpredictable co-channel interference issues with more predictable, but also issues that reduce overall throughput. So you end up in a situation where throughput's the same. It's just how reliable the throughput is. So our smart antenna technology, instead of using one fixed antenna pattern, it has the ability to go through hundreds of different antenna patterns and choose an antenna pattern that optimizes the signal based on where the client is to it. As far as I know, when it comes to this smart antenna technology, this is really exclusive to us and Ruckus. So Ruckus has their own flavor of this that they call BeamFlex Plus. So if you're a Ruckus reseller, you're probably familiar with that technology. Now, our algorithm not only takes into account where the client device is in relationship to the client, it also takes into account where other sources of RF interference may be at, in this case represented by a microwave, and choosing an antenna pattern that tries to ignore signals coming in that it doesn't want to listen to. So it does both of those. And it requires nothing special on the client device. We often get asked if this is the same thing as, oh Jesus, I apologize, my mind's just went blank on the term, beamforming. Is it the same as beamforming? It is not. Um, Beamforming uses changing the power output on different antennas. This actually has a much larger selection of antennas and changes which antennas are online and being used and which ones are not. And unlike beamforming, it works perfectly fine with with mobile users. So it keeps up where beamforming tends to not. Just a second here. So here's a real world example, real test we did in I believe this was a hotel. So this is using the more modern way of doing hotels where each room gets its own low powered access point. In the room, it's using 5 gigahertz channels. We're avoiding DFS channels. So as you can see on this one floor, we've only got one AP using 100 channel 100. And then on another floor above it, we've got some additional AAPs that are using the same channel, but not directly over each other. So in this scenario, we took our access point and a ubiquity access point. Both are the same form factor. Both are roughly the same when it comes to power output. The main difference is smart antenna versus non-smart antenna. So with one AP on and being tested, throughput's basically the same. In fact, ubiquity was had slightly better aggregated throughput, 406 to 404 aggregated throughput between the two. But where it shines now is when we turn on that second AP on the other floor. You can see here that because they're sharing that signal, they're having to share that same bandwidth. You start to run into some issues here. So what we see is with ubiquity, with the two APs, the aggregated throughput between those two APs on the wireless is 555. Whereas the aggregated throughput with our smart antenna technology is 785. So we're able to achieve better overall speed between the two access points. And you'll see here, the reason for that is because ubiquity, these APs are sharing that spectrum, and you're getting up to 95% airtime utilization, right? You can't get much more than this aggregated throughput with the available airtime on that channel. But because our smart antenna technology is able to ignore some of that signal coming between the two access points, it allows the users on those access points to be able to broadcast at the same time without interfering with each other, or at least with less interference on each other. So we're actually able to achieve greater than 100% airtime utilization when you add the airtime between the two different access points. So that's why we're able to get this faster throughput. It's that smart antenna that's doing it. So if we turn on that third access point using channel 100, we've now got the aggregated throughput a little over 900. Whereas over here on the Ubiquiti product, it's basically the same as it was before, just a little over 500 aggregated throughput. Why? Again, airtime, it's available. Ubiquiti maxes out, in this case, it maxes out at 91. So why did airtime utilization goes down? Because of interference issues causing packets to be rebroadcast. So more of your packets are getting dropped. Your clients are more timid about when they can broadcast. So airtime utilization dropped just a little bit from 95 to 91. Where with us, airtime utilization went up to 155% of the theoretical max. The other thing you will notice is the throughput is roughly the same between each of these access points because the smart antenna is essentially allowing them to equally share the available channel that's available. Whereas on the Ubiquiti, it's every man for themselves. The access points are fighting with each other for that limited amount of airtime. And some of them do a better job than others at winning that battle. So overall better throughput, overall more equal distribution of your throughput, able to get above 100% airtime utilization. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking about 6 gigahertz. We're getting close to the end, guys, I promise. Um, so with 6 gigahertz, this was something that was recently unlocked. I want to say it was about 2 years ago by the FCC in North America, and many other companies have followed, or countries, excuse me, not companies, have followed suit. And so it first became available in Wi-Fi 6E. So Wi-Fi 6E, the E stands for extended, meaning it's the same as regular Wi-Fi 6, only extended out to work on 6 gigahertz instead of just 2.4 and 5. Some products would do 2 of those channels, some would do all 3 simultaneously. The main thing here and the main reason for the move to 6 gigahertz is there's a ton of available bandwidth. So to put that in perspective, here's 2.4. This is how much bandwidth is available for everyone to share. Here's how much is available on 5 gigahertz for everyone to share. And here's how much is available for 6 gigahertz for everyone to share. So as you can see, 6 gigahertz has more available bandwidth than 2.4 and 5 gigahertz combined. So that's why there's been this big push into 6 gigahertz, is because it allows you to solve a lot of those bandwidth issues and those interference issues between the access points. You can see here when we're doing 160 megahertz channels, with Wi-Fi 6, you've got 2 channels, both of which require DFS. With 6 gigahertz, you have 7 channels, which require nothing special. So what are the cons of doing 6 gigahertz as it sits today? So similar to 5 gigahertz, there were already lots of users of 6 gigahertz. It's just they had to have a license to use it. And they continue to use it with their license. So with Wi-Fi or with 5 gigahertz, we had those DFS channels. With 6 gigahertz, it's a little bit different. So with 6 gigahertz, as long as you were deploying indoors and you were using what I'm going to call standard power, 30, whatever it is, 30 dBm, 36 dBm, whatever it is. Most products are probably in the, 24 to 30 space. Doesn't require anything special. You just use it indoors as you would want, because again, 6 gigahertz is a higher frequency, so the signal is going to travel less, so it's less likely to interfere with a licensed 6 gigahertz user who is outdoors or in a different building. Now, the trade-off is if you want to use 6 gigahertz outdoors, you have to buy special equipment that supports what's called an AFC, automatic frequency control. So instead of using DFS, where you sort of listen and then disconnect users if you see somebody else, with DFS, your access point, your router that's being used outdoors, or your indoor access point that's using super high, like 36 dBm output power, or using external antennas, it has to connect to this AFC provider. So it's a third-party provider on the internet who tracks all of the licensed users and where they are located. It then has to geolocate where your access point is, check with that server, and then if there are any 6 gigahertz licensed users nearby, it will then either blacklist those channels so you can't use them, or it will reduce your power on those channels so it doesn't cause interference with the licensed users. And it has to do this check every 24 hours. So because of that, 6 gigahertz outdoor equipment has taken a while to hit the market. And because of that, our 6 gigahertz products don't fit in our outdoor enclosures because you aren't supposed to be using them out there. So we will have outdoor 6 gigahertz products at some point. For us at Zycel, the latest roadmap I've heard though is very end of this year, so end of 2025 at the earliest. So it's not coming soon, and that's just because you have to work with these different AFC providers. There's a lot of different ones out there, and they all have different business models as to how much you have to pay them to use their service or how they monetize that service. So it's taken a while as we let that side of the business mature, so we can decide, which business model and which providers we're going to support. So just keep that in mind. Another challenge when it comes to 6 gigahertz and basically Wi-Fi 7, particularly tri-radio Wi-Fi 7, is the hardware costs a lot more, right? You have to support 3 radios at the same time. And because you're aggregating the throughput between 3 radios, you need a faster CPU to handle all that extra data. And you probably want a faster uplink port, so your uplink port isn't the bottleneck. And then on top of that, all that requires more power. So a lot of these devices will not work with standard 802.3 BT, or excuse me, AT PoE, PoE plus. A lot of these products require 802.3 BT, which is the 60 watt PoE standard. So because of that, if you're deploying Wi-Fi 7, you may say, hey, I don't need to upgrade my Ethernet speeds yet. The wireless users aren't going to be maxing it out. I don't need to do that, but you can't power the APs. So now you've got to buy expensive switches. If you're going to buy a switch that supports 60 watt PoE, you might as well buy one that supports multi-gig as well, right? So it can be a big upgrade and a big cost if you're deploying tri-band Wi-Fi 7 today versus, dual radio or older technology. So we'll talk really quick here about Wi-Fi 7. In theory, the maximum throughput supported across all 3 radios aggregated is 46 gigabits per second. Our fastest product is 22. And again, this is your data rate, not your throughput. So actual throughput's going to be half that or less, because chances are that that access point doesn't have dual 10 gig uplinks on it, for instance. You're not using a 25 gig SFP because you need PoE power to power the access point. They increased the QAM from 1024 to 4096. So that gives you about a 20% increase in data that can be encoded on the radio waves. As I mentioned earlier, we've now got 320 megahertz channels. And we have some cool technology that has hit the market that's on Wi-Fi 7. The first one is called MLO, multi-link operation. It allows a client device to connect to multiple radios in your access point at the same time. So with 11AC and Wi-Fi 6, even if your client device may support 2.4 and 5 and 6, but it usually can only connect to one of those at a time. Multi-link operation, in theory, would allow you to connect to all 3 of those radios at the same time. And it can be used to increase your overall aggregated speed. It can be used to reduce latency. It can be used to rebroadcast the same traffic across multiple radios. So if one has interference, the packets come through on another, etc. So it's cool technology. I want to say all of our 100 and higher level access points do have it enabled now, I believe. The challenge is on the client side of things, as it always is. We're still at that point where most clients still don't support 6 gigahertz at all. And now they're being asked to support 2 or 3 radios being on at the same time, right? If you're connecting to the 6 gigahertz radio and the 5 gigahertz radio, you have to have 2 radios receiving and broadcasting on your mobile device at the same time. So the challenge of that is you're now basically doubling the power drain of that Wi-Fi chip. And if you want to do three, you've got to triple that power, right? So you're supporting three radios simultaneously. And again, you need a faster CPU in there to handle all the extra data coming through. So because of that, there's not very many client devices that support MLO. There's a few. The other challenge is there's lots of different flavors and ways of implementing MLO. So there are a certain vendor out there that has a MLO advertised compatible device, right? Multi-link operation, but it only supports one radio at a time. So how do you have multiple links with only one radio? And the answer to that is the MLO spec does support a single link MLO operation, which basically just means that that one radio can very quickly change between, say, the 5 and 6 gigahertz radios as needed based on signal strength or RF interference issues. So it's only one link, but it's very fast moving between the links, much faster than traditional roaming, basically. Some client devices will support two radios. Some client devices will support three radios, and some of them, when supporting multiple radios, drop the power or drop the amount of bandwidth each radio can support, etc. So I want to say there's like 6 or 7 different ways of implementing MLO on the client side of things, just to confuse things and make things harder for us. There is also something called multiple AP coordination. This is supposed to be part of a second release of Wi-Fi 7, a second updated standard that's supposed to come out in a few years. I do not know whether firmware updates will enable this on existing hardware or not, but basically it allows the APs to communicate with each other and helps with roaming and helps with channel utilization and things like that. We'll skip this. This is just sort of a timeline of the different technologies and what they support. I've already said all that multiple times tonight. So let's talk about, when is Wi-Fi 6 ideal? What is driving adoption of 6 gigahertz? And the answer to that is, for the most part, high density to environments where you've got either a lot of users or a lot of access points, apartments, condos, trade show floors, meeting centers, things like that. Why? Because again, 6 gigahertz has a tremendous amount of bandwidth. So you can fit more users on there. You can fit more access points in there before they start interfering with each other. Also for those applications that need ridiculously high bandwidth, right? So if you are doing 8K streaming or you're trying to stream VR, you can take advantage of these higher bandwidths to stream at a higher bit rate and to reduce or eliminate the need to compress the video. So like today, right now, you can buy a Quest 3 or Quest 2, and you can Wi-Fi stream over 5 gigahertz from your PC to your headset. But it does degrade the signal a little bit, and it adds some additional lag. And if you've ever played with VR, you know VR is nauseating enough without additional lag being added. So in theory, 6 gigahertz allows you to stream that video uncompressed and essentially create zero delay streaming or near zero delay streaming versus using 5 gigahertz today. Another interesting application here is for mesh, doing wireless backhaul. Most of your users are using 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. So let's use that 6 gigahertz radio to wirelessly link your access points together for business class mesh. So this may be finally the technology that allows mesh to be something you can deploy in an enterprise or business environment. The limited 5 gigahertz bandwidth has really been what had stopped mesh from being adopted in the business, right? It's very common to see mesh in home installs, very rare to see it in business installs. So maybe 6 gigahertz changes that. And this is just giving some examples of what we talked about. We're over time here, so I'm just going to skip those. So here we go. Some tips and tricks for different environments for you. So keep in mind, most access points just have a single set of antennas that are optimized for the idea that you're going to mount them on the ceiling directly above the area to be covered. So if you are mounting them on the wall, you end up in a less than ideal antenna coverage. You end up sending a lot of signal up into the ceiling, down into the floor, whether it's either lost or interferes with users, on those other floors. So we offer something called dual optimized antennas. You will see that on a number of our access points that end in the suffix D or D-I. And basically on those access points, we have two sets of antennas, a ceiling mount antenna and a wall mount antenna. So you can pick and choose which antennas to use based on where you've mounted that access point. But just in general, when it comes to ceiling mount, you want to mount the access point as high as possible and as centrally as possible in the area to be covered within reason. If you've got 60-foot ceilings, you may not want to put them all the way up there. But in a typical environment, you would mount them, as high up as you could. And the idea behind that is you want to minimize the amount of obstructions between your client device and the access point, right? You don't want that signal going through people and printers and cubicle walls and stuff like that. You'd like it to have as much open air as possible. So generally, high is better. So we do make clips for mounting these on the T-bar that holds up drop ceilings. If you are in a place that allows you to mount access points above a drop ceiling, it may speed up your install because you don't have to punch holes in the drop ceiling to run Ethernet. You don't have to buy special mounting clips. You can simply set the access point on top of the drop ceiling, and it'll work great. The drop ceilings are usually made out of it's kind of like a shredded cardboard or cellulose material. They do not degrade the signal that much, so it's very easy to mount them. But again, you have to check. Some of you are in places where you can't mount stuff like that in the plenum space above the drop ceiling due to fire code or what have you. When you are mounting stuff on the ceiling, take into account ductwork, lighting, conduit, any sort of dense or metal things that are up on that ceiling. You may need to buy, and there are places that sell these extender poles that you mount the pole on the ceiling and it drops down below those obstructions. And then you mount your access point onto that because you don't want those other things up there blocking or reflecting the signal. So hotels, traditionally hotels have used what we call umbrella pattern installations, where you would mount access points in the hallway and they would cover 4, 8, or even some cases 16 rooms all at once. We have gotten away from that as wireless users become more plentiful and wireless users start using up more bandwidth and become more demanding, right? You don't want your guest complaining that they can't do their video conference call. They keep freezing up because they're don't have enough bandwidth. So because of that, most newer mid-tier and higher hotels are moving to 1 AP per room with the AP installed in the room itself, or one for every other room I've seen a lot doing. And we make, and everyone makes these days, special hospitality APs specifically for this deployment. Usually these access points have lower output power than your traditional, ceiling mount access points. They're usually designed to be mounted on a wall directly on a cable access or junction box. So your internet with PoE plugs directly into the back or the bottom of the access point. And then you've usually got 2 or more Ethernet ports, which can then be used to daisy chain to an IPTV in the room, to an IP phone in the room, etc. So you're just running one Cat6 cable to the room, and it's powering up your access point, it's powering up your IP phone, and it's providing internet for all of those devices, including your IPTV. If you are doing ceiling mount antennas or access points, find access points where you can turn off the LEDs. No one wants an access point flashing lights at them when they're trying to go to sleep. So all of our APs do have the ability to disable most of the LEDs through the Nebula interface. Just some other strategies here. Plan different areas individually. So you plan your hotel rooms one way, plan your outdoor space one way, plan your lobby, plan your restaurants or your bars. Treat them all as individual installations and plan based on the usage and the number of users they're going to have and the type of users they're going to have in those spaces. Absolutely use load balancing and client steering. And when you are deploying this, be sure you set up the groups in the interface. So your AP in the lobby isn't trying to load balance users onto an AP located on the 8th floor where no one's checked in yet. So you'll create groups based on the physical location to control the roaming and the load balancing. Any area where you've got a lot of users or a lot of access points, use smart antenna. It makes a huge difference in guest quality. For schools, it depends on the type of classroom it is. These days we're getting more and more smart classrooms, and it depends how they're using it. So in a lot of what they call smart classrooms, the tablet or the Chromebook is only doing a little bit of data, maybe for research, maybe for test taking, maybe for submitting papers, where in other types of smart classrooms, instead of using, for instance, a projector or a screen at the front of the room, I've seen cases where the teacher streams their desktop to all of their users. So obviously, if you're needing to support 20 or 30 or 40 video streams simultaneously, you'll need more access points than if they're just using the internet for research or for the occasional, test taking or paper submission. So take that into account. In general, the teacher and student should be on their own separate networks. The students should not have, should be VLAN walled off from the teachers so they don't access teacher resources. But general, as we get to 20 or more students, as a general rule, I would suggest 2 access points per room. And we do have a special load balancing algorithm specifically for smart classrooms where you'll have 20, 30 or more people connecting simultaneously. And really consider using smart antenna for classrooms of 30 or more students. And with that, guys, we are finally done. I know I ran long. I do apologize. If you have any questions, none have come in, so send them in using chat or Q&A. I'll wait around here for a minute or so to see if any questions come in, but I do appreciate you guys coming out. While I'm waiting, do check out our user forums, forum.zycel.com. This is a place for you to talk to other Zycel users. And unlike a lot of other user forums out there, these are monitored by our product management and R&D teams. And occasionally they'll even wade in and answer questions. Although mostly they're using it for feedback to see which issues people are most encountering, so we know how to prioritize them or which feature requests to prioritize. It's also where we often are the first place to post notifications about firmware updates, security updates, things like that. Okay, I have no questions, so I'm going to go ahead and end today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. I hope I see you on one of our future webinars.